Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth day of this bootcamp. Today, we will be continuing with JavaScript. All right. So on the first day, we saw some HTML. We learned about the basic tags that were available to us, what attributes are, and how to add content on a page and how to organize the content. On the next day, we talked a bit more about CSS, which served us in styling our page. So through the use of CSS, we were able to change the color, we were able to change the size of things, we were able to add spacing in the form of margins and padding, add borders, and also a lot of other properties that we can change. Then yesterday on the third day, we discussed about JavaScript and basically how to take some part of an HTML of our HTML page and how to modify it using JavaScript. We discussed about how to get an element using its ID, using its class, using the tag name that was assigned to it. And we discussed how to call functions on certain events such as mouse over and mouse out and on click. Today, we will be continuing with JavaScript and we would be moving away from the browser for a bit. And instead of the browser, we would be taking a look at JavaScript more as an independent general purpose programming language. So what we all saw till yesterday was about using JavaScript to take an input. The input can be some detail given by the user. It can be an HTML element, or it can be a number or a string. Making some changes to it or processing it in some way, and then showing an output either in the console or showing it in the form of updated HTML on our web page. So today, let's take a look at the different features available to us within JavaScript. And in order to do that, let's move away from the browser a bit and let's just take a look at JavaScript independently. And so in order to do that, we will be using something called Node. Node is, for now, you can just think of it as something that allows us to use JavaScript outside of the browser, locally on our system, without the browser. By the way, do know if my screen is visible and if I am audible. So is my screen visible and am I audible clearly?
Yes, you are audible and your screen is also visible.
All right. Cool. So let's continue. Okay, so Node actually is a way to run JavaScript on the server side as opposed to the browser. But we can also use it to run JavaScript code locally. Most of you may have learned about C in your first semester of college. And you may have used either GCC or maybe Turbo C. You write a simple program, you press on run, and you see an output. In the case of GCC, you write your program, you save it, you pass that file to GCC, then you get a compiled file and you can run it. Similarly, Node will allow us to do something similar for JavaScript. We can write some JS in a single file. And then when we pass that file name to Node, it should run. Test it out. Let's just try something. Let's create a new file. Let's call it what do I call it? Let's call it test.js for now.
Will you please zoom, sir?
Yeah, what do you want me to?
Zoom.
Hello?
Will you please enlarge your screen, sir?
Okay, sure. This should be visible, I think.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Console.log, as we saw yesterday, simply sends an output to the console. Since you're not using the browser, instead of sending it to the browser's console, the output would be seen in our terminal. Let's just try it out. As always, the first program we'll be writing is hello world. Save it. And now if I run node test.js, I get hello world. Cool, this works. All right. So don't get confused with these commands. You don't really need to know about them. Just focus on the JavaScript part of it and focus on the syntax for today. Let's move out of here for a bit. Now, coming back to the browser, we did talk a little bit about browser compatibility when we were discussing CSS. And just to give you a very brief introduction about the problems that we may face when using JavaScript. Each browser, like Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, each of them, they all have their own different JavaScript engines. And these JavaScript engines are responsible for executing the JavaScript that we give to them. So right now I'm using Chrome. In the case of Chrome, Chrome uses the V8 engine. And Firefox, I think, if I remember correctly, uses something called Spider Monkey. And then Safari and Edge and Internet Explorer, they all have their own separate JavaScript engine. So while the JavaScript engines are separate, they all implement something called the ECMAScript standard. ECMAScript is written as CMS, this thing. So they all implement something called the ECMAScript standard. And while all of them implement the standard, some of them may have some additional features in addition to the ECMAScript. So some JavaScript code that may work on one browser may not necessarily work on another browser. But if you stick to the concepts available in ECMAScript, they should work on all major browsers. Now, coming back to our code, we will mostly be discussing today about the syntax that is available to us as part of the ES6 standard. ES6 is think of it as a version of ECMAScript. And this was released in 2015. And all major browsers, I mean, even Internet Explorer, it supports ES6 to some extent. I mean, I'm not sure about Internet Explorer actually, but Edge does support ES6. So we will be discussing about ES6. And after 2015, every year there has been new versions. The latest one was released just last month in June 2021, ECMAScript 2021. And there have been some additions to the syntax. There have been some additional inbuilt functions. But if you know the basics, if you know ES6, it's pretty easy to pick up all those new features, all those new functions. As always, remember to check out the MDN pages. If you go to MDN, go to references. I'll be repeating this thing in almost every session that we have because this is like the most useful resource if you're a web developer. Go to JavaScript, you'll find about the different standards that are available to you and the different built-in objects, the expressions and statements, and the different things that you can do with JavaScript. go to the syntax, you'll find all of the different syntaxes available, including a table of browser compatibility. So remember, if you're using ES6, if you're not using any additional things, you should be compatible with almost all of the new browsers. Now, let's take a look at some of the basics. So if you have used basically any programming language, you may be familiar with the concept that each program has three things. One is taking an input. You need a way to get an input from either the user or from another program or from anywhere, but you need a way to get an input. The second thing that you do with the program is to actually process that input. So let's say you write a program that gives you the double of any number that you have inputted. If you give the input 2, you get 4, you give 4, you get 8. And JavaScript is also similar. So we have methods to get the input. We have things that will process that input. And then we have different ways to show that show the process data. And in order to hold the input, we need to use variables of some kind. Variables are named memory locations. There is a bit more to it, but for now, just think of them as a name that you have given to a container, which holds in some value. In JavaScript, as we saw yesterday, variables are declared using the var keyword. And then you can write the name of the variable followed by the value of the variable. If you're talking about ES6, there are two more ways to declare variables called let and const. So you may be thinking, if we have var, then why do we need let and const? And the difference may not be very clear to you right now, but as you start using a bit more JavaScript, it would become apparent why we do need it. For now, just think of let and const as those variables that are available only within the block in which they are declared. Basically, if you write var name, it is available everywhere in your JavaScript file. If you use let or const, it's available only within the block in which it is declared. And blocks are basically these curly brackets or braces. And you would usually be using them when you're talking about functions or within loops or within some condition. So yeah, these are the three ways to declare a variable. One is var, which is available everywhere, and let and const are available only within the block in which they are declared. So just to take an example, let's say I create a function and I call it some random. And then in this function, I have yes equal to 0. And let's also add test equal to 5 over here. And let's console.log the value of test. And also console.log the value of let's also console.log the value of test outside over here. So this will become test again, save it, and we run it. Test outside is 5, and test outside is not printed because we need to call the function. Okay, so as you can see, inside the value is 0, outside the value is 5, which is as expected. Outside we had it 5, inside it was 0. And let's try the same thing with, let's change it to where, and let's try the same thing again. Inside is 0, outside it's 5. But let's do one thing. Let's remove this where. And let's write now. Inside is 0, outside is also 0. And why did this happen was because, so what really happened was we initialized test over here. It's also accessible over here. And if we make any changes within the function, those changes would change our original value. With let, it's the variables are block scoped. So anything that's within the block stays within the block. You won't really be able to access it outside the block. And let's also try one other thing. Let's get rid of this line. Let's make this a var. And let's save it. Check it out once. So let me get rid of the code that I've written up. All right. So we just have a single function. We are calling that function, and inside the function, we are printing the value of a variable. Outside the function, we are printing the value of the variable once again. But notice that we have only initialized the variable over here within the function. Now, if I run it, I get a reference error called test is not defined. This happens because since this was created within this function, it's not really accessible over here. But if I don't initialize it over there and instead I write it over here, it works. So we initialize var test outside a function, it's still available inside the function, and the value that we assign to it inside the function is available outside as well. If we try to do the same thing using let, works again. And this is a concept known as hoisting. What's basically happening is that all your initializing statements, they are moved to the top of your code before it's executed. So if you initialize any variable anywhere, it would actually be moved to the top of the code. Now, if we try the same thing with const, I expect this to fail, and it does fail. Why does this happen? Because a const is used to declare a constant, and as the name implies, the value is constant. It cannot be changed. Moving on, let's get rid of this. Let's take a look at arrays a bit, and let's try to create an array. So for those of you that do not know it, arrays are just they're just a bunch of variables in a linear order. And this is how you define an array in JavaScript. You write your square brackets, and within that can give it any number of values in a comma separated list. Now, if you're coming from the C, C++, or Java family of languages, this may be a bit shocking to you, but in JavaScript, arrays can have different types of values within the same array. If I try to print it, this should work. Right, it gets printed just as it is. So if you have learned C, C++, or Java, this may look a bit counterintuitive, but in JavaScript, the types inside of an array do not matter. You can add anything that you want, as long as it's a list of things that JavaScript.
Sir,
Yeah.
sorry for the interruption. Your voice is very low, sir. Can you just speak a bit louder?
Okay, let me just. Looks fine to me. Is it still not audible?
It's low only, sir.
Okay, is it better now?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right, so sorry for the interruption. In case you missed it, quickly reiterating the previous concept, arrays in JavaScript can have multiple values, and they do not need to be all of the same type. This is a bit different from the C, C++, and Java family of languages, where arrays all need to have the same type of values inside of them. So in JavaScript, you can have numbers, you can have your strings, you can have null, undefined, and even with all those different types of values, it will still work. And actually, in JavaScript, you can also have functions inside of an array. So you can simply have a function, and this function, let's say console.logs hello. All right. So this should also work without any issues, right? We have a bunch of numbers, we have strings, we have null and undefined types, and we can also put in an entire function within an array, no issues. And this is what we mean by functions being a first-class citizen in JavaScript. You can treat them basically as just any other value. You can pass it, like you can also pass a function to another function. And let's say that we want to execute this function. We can do that by simply calling that function. So 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's on the 8th index. And let's just try to print this first. We get the function just as we expected. And if I execute it by adding these brackets in front of it, and I run it again, I get hello and then undefined. Undefined is it's the return type. It returned nothing. And let's try to return something from it. So, looks a bit better. And if I return 0, and boom. So I got hello, which was console.logged, and then I got 0, which was the return value of that function. So arrays are a bit different in the sense that you can put in anything that you want. You can even put in functions, and you can also execute those functions. Now let's talk a bit about types before we move on. And so JavaScript basically has dynamic typing. You don't really need to give the type. You just need to say that you have a variable, which you can do using the var letter const keyword, and write the name of the variable and give it any value. You can also change that value later on. So let's say that you have var a equals to 2. You can then change it to a string as well. And then if you console.log this and run it, it would work. In most other programming languages, most other statically or strongly typed programming languages, this won't work. A type is fixed when a variable is initialized. But in JavaScript, there's no such constraint. You can give it any type, it would still work. You can change the type later on, it will still work, no issues. So this is both a boon and a bane. It does give you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can do with variables, but at the same time, it can be a cause of many bugs if you are not careful with it. Now, to talk about types, we have a few different types. One of them is undefined. There's null. There's Boolean. We also have number and string. And we also have something called symbol. Don't worry about symbol for now. You won't really be needing it. Let's focus on the above view that we have. So undefined basically is an undefined value. We just saw that when we did not return anything, we got undefined. Null is the absence of anything. Unlike undefined, null denotes that there is nothing. There is just null, there's void. Undefined can be anything that's not defined. So if you initialize a variable and you don't give it a value, it's undefined. But null is the absence of a value. Boolean is true or false. True is truthy, false is something that's not true. You will mostly be using this to check for conditions and yeah, mostly when you are checking for conditions. Numbers are your numbers. They can be floating point as well. And strings, as we just saw, are regular strings. You can use both double quotes and single quotes for your strings, no issues. And we are not going to discuss symbol for now. You won't really be needing it, at least for this bootcamp, and even for most of your projects, you won't really be dealing with symbols. Is someone trying to say something? All right. Okay, before we move on, let's also discuss a bit about objects. So objects are another type of things that you can have. And objects, they are like they are built through a combination of these above types, right? These string, number, boolean, null, and defined, these are your primitive types. These are the most basic types that are available, that are provided to you by JavaScript itself. And then your objects, they are made when you combine these types to build a bigger object, right? So a very common example of this would be location object. Now you can refer to any location on the world using two things. You can use latitude and longitude to refer to any location. Individually, your latitude would be a number, and same for your longitude. This would also be a number. But it would not make a lot of sense to track two separate variables just to get to know one single location. And to solve that, we have objects. And objects, like you can have a location object. And this location can have your latitude, which will be a number, and your longitude, which will be a number. This is just one example. You can have different other types of objects. Just to give you an idea, when you combine a bunch of primitive types, you can use that combination to track just a single value, a single object, and that object will then give you access to all of the different properties of that object. Let's check it out. Actually, let's try to run it. So if I add longitude, let's just create a location object. And objects are created using this curly brackets or braces. And they are basically key value pairs. So you have a key. In this case, the keys are latitude and longitude. Let's call it 23.7 something. And then the longitude can be 73 point something. And then this becomes your object. And if you try to print the value of this object, this is what you get. Now you can also access the individual fields inside of an object using the dot operator. So if you write location.lat, you would get the latitude, which was 23.7. And if you use location.long, you would get the longitude. And just like we saw in arrays, you can also have functions. So let's say if I have a function called print over here, I can actually print the location. That's a part of this object. So this can be the dot that is dot long. And the function is there. Now let's just try to get the value of the function. Location.print. If we execute that function, we get the location in a formatted manner, and we can define any type of function that we want within that object. So quick recap. Right. So arrays are a list of values. They don't have a key. They just have a list of values. and we access them using the index. Indexing starts from 0, and in order to access the 9th element over here, we use the 8th index. And this is how arrays work without a key. And when we talk about objects, objects have a key, and we use the keys to access the fields within an object. But both arrays and objects, they are just a collection of your primitive data types. And they can also contain objects and arrays within themselves. But for now, let's just think of them as a collection of values. Arrays do not have keys, they just have values. Objects, they have a key, and then that key has some value. And to access that value, you use object name dot key name, and you get access to that value. Now, let's talk a bit about conversion between.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Sir, is it necessary to every key has a value inside object?
Is it necessary for every key to have a value?
Yes, sir,
Yes,
inside
sir.
the object.
So yes, every key does need to have a value. You cannot just have a key. The value can be null, it can be undefined, but there needs to be a value. So let's say I write no value over here, and I run this will be an error because we are not actually defining it.
Thank you, sir.
But if you want, you can give it a value of null in case you do not have a value to give it right now. And the code works, but let's try to print no value. So no value gives us null. And later on, if say I do want to give it a value, I can give location dot no value equal to some value. And now if I run it, I get some value. So you cannot just write a key without giving it a value, but you can give it null or undefined.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Now let's check out conversion between the different types. So conversion is done using all right, let's say I have a value called x equal to 20. Then let's just let's try to print it. And let's check it out. So we get x equal to 20 just as we expected. Now let's say instead of 20 being a number, I want it to be a string. There are two different ways to do it. One is using explicit conversion. So that can be done using this function called string, and whatever I pass to it will be converted into a string. And now if I print console.log x equal to x, right, not really visible over here, but you can see through the difference in the color, you can see that this was a number and this was a string. And Another way to do the same thing is using implicit conversion. And just as the name suggests, in the case of implicit conversion, we are not really telling JavaScript what to do. We are not really telling Node what to do. It will automatically see that we have X, which is a number, and we are adding some string to it. And in this case, it will convert both of them to a string. I mean, it will convert the number to a string just to match the type with the higher order. And I did this, and this should work. Right. So the first one was number, the next two are strings. Right. This was a plain number 20. And then this was converted to a string. You know what, let me just change it a little bit. Oops. X equal to right. So this way you can see that this is a string, and let's also update this. Right. This is still a number, and then this is printed with quotes indicating that it's a string. Don't worry about JSON.stringify for now. Basically, this is just a function that takes in an object and returns a string representation of that object. And if our object is just a simple number, it will return that number. If it's a simple string, it will return that string. And in the string representation, we can see that quotes are added. So I use it just to show that this is actually a string as opposed to a number. But yeah, so the point was that there are two different ways to convert and to convert a variable from one type to another. One is explicit, the other is implicit. In explicit, we basically give it the type in which we wanted it to be converted. In our case, it was string. So we write string, we give some brackets. Within the brackets, we pass in the number, and then the number gets converted to a string. The other method is to take in our number like this, and then simply add a string to it. Now, what basically happens over here is Node sees this, and then it sees that one of them is a number, the other is a string. You can't really add a number and a string. And so what it tries to do over here is it tries to concatenate these two. By concatenation, we simply mean it tries to combine these two together as a string. And in order to do that, this must become a string. So implicitly, it becomes a string. We are not asking it to be converted to a string. It just happens because there's no other option. It has to be a string if it has to work with another string. Now, before we move on, let's just take a look at today's attendance code. Right, this is your code for today. Take a look at it, take a screenshot if you want. We have it on the screen for another minute, and we'll continue after this. All right, so let's continue. We have the code for another 5 seconds. Quickly take a screenshot if you need it, and then we'll be moving on. All right. So let's talk about another thing. Let's talk about conditions. Now, if you have used any type of programming language, or if you have ever dealt with any kind of logic before, you know that conditions are really important. And using conditions is how basically any program works. You need to check the different conditions, and you perform an action based on one of the conditions that matches. And in order to check conditions in JavaScript, you can use the if keyword. So let's try it out. X equals to 10. If x is 10, then we print yes. Otherwise, we print no. Okay, so this is a very simple program. You have one variable, we give it the value 10. We are checking if the value is equal to 10, we print yes. If not, we print no. Now, what should be printed? Yes. And if I change this condition to x being greater than 10, then this will print no. So pretty clear. We evaluate a condition. If it's true, this part is executed within the if block. Otherwise, if this is false, the statements that are written inside this else block, these are executed. Now, let's remove this for now. And let's get rid of this as well. There's another way to check for conditions. If you have learned about C or C++ in college, then you might be familiar with the ternary operator. It's the same thing over here as well. So let's see, let's call it the result equals to, and then we write a condition. If x is greater than 10, I want my result value to be true. Otherwise, this should be false. And if I print this, I get false because 10 is not greater than 10. It's equal to 10. So just to check if it still works, I do this, I get true because 10 is indeed equal to 10. So this is another way of checking for a condition. Now, this is 10, which is a number, right? And let's try to do something strange. Let's compare it with a string. If you have used C, C++, or Java, this would definitely be false. But in JavaScript, this is true. And why is that? This is because this operator, the double equals to operator or the equality check, this would only check for an equivalent value. It won't really check for the same type. Right now, this would actually coerce the type. So what would happen is this x, which is equal to 10, the number 10, would be coerced to the string 10, and then those would be checked for equality. In order to get the similar behavior, like C, C++, or Java, where you are strictly checking for equal value as well as equal type. You need to add a third equal to symbol over here. So this would require equivalent types as well as the same value. And now if I run it, this evaluates to false. Right. I expect there might be some questions with reference to this. So, right. Question is equal to and triple equal to. What's the difference between the two? This is the difference. Double equal to will actually coerce the types to be the same type, and then it will check the value. Triple equal to will strictly check the value and the type as well. If the types are not equal, it will give false. If the values are not equal, it will give false. In the case of double equal to, if the values become the same after conversion of the types, it would return true. So this can be a cause of a lot of headaches and many potential bugs. So always try to use triple equal to. You won't, I mean, there would be very few cases where you would actually need to use the double equal to, but if you do need it, it's there. Now, let's talk a little bit more about, let's talk a bit about functions and passing some values into functions. And function, as we also today, as well as yesterday when we discussed JavaScript, functions are declared using the function keyword. And then we write the name of the function. Let's call it my function. Then we have these parentheses, and then we write the body of the function within the braces. And this can simply be hello. And if we run it, nothing happens. Why did nothing happen? It should be clear to everyone by now. Can I get an answer in the chat? Or on using your mic as well?
So because we haven't called that function.
Exactly, because we did not call that function. So now, how to call the function? Simply by writing the name of the function and adding the parentheses after this. Now, if I write it, it prints hello. Now, let's not call this function. Let's call another function and call it add. So remember, at the very start of today's session, I told you three things that are a part of every program. We take in an input, we process that input, and then we send an output. The way to send some value to a function, the way to take in an input to within a function is by using parameters. And I have a simple function called add, and I want to add two values. And I can just give it two values in the form of two variables, variable A, variable B. What this denotes is that we just created a function, and that function will take in two values. And within that function, we can access these values. And we'll just print the sum of these values. Now, how to actually pass in the values? We do that while calling the function. This is how we normally call a function. To pass a value, inside those parentheses, just write those two values. Let's say 4 and 5. And we run it. We get a syntax error, unexpected token var. And yeah, so this was supposed to happen. We need to change this. Right, we get 9. We don't really need to add var over there. It's just it will work. It will automatically it will box those values for you.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yeah.
Sir, in previous method in array, when we declared a function, when there was a no return type, it displayed undefined. Now we are calling the function without any return type. Why isn't it printing undefined?
I did not notice why that. Let me just check it once again. All right, so we printed add. Okay. All right, so in order to answer your question, I will need two windows. All right, and let's take a look at the two programs that we created. And then it was array, I suppose.
Yes, sir.
Right. So why is it that we are getting the return type over there and not over here? The answer is very simple. If I remove console.log from here, we will not get the return type. So what's really actually happening over here is, let's just restore it first. Right. So what really happened was we called this function executed. We printed hello inside this function. Then we returned some value. The value came over here inside console.log, and then that value was console logged.
Yes, sir. Now it's clear.
Right. In this case, since we are not writing a console.log, which is wrapping the function call, we are not getting that value. So
Yes, sir.
yeah. And let's just get rid of this. And come over here. All right. So this is how you call a function. This is how you pass a value. And just as we saw, instead of directly printing the answer over here, we can return the value. In fact, let's do one thing. Result equals to A plus B. Result. What did I do? Okay, I didn't print it. All right. So take a look at this function. We take in some input, which is passed by us over here. We do some processing on it, which is adding those two, storing it in another value. And then we give an output in the form of this return statement. And that's basically what every program does. You get in an input, process it, and then you return it. And with that, let's close functions for now. And right, so I guess we are out of time. Let's wrap things up for today at this point. Today we discussed about the basic types in JavaScript. We discussed about arrays. We discussed a little bit about objects and about typecasting and about functions. There's a lot more to all of these concepts, as well as there are a lot of more concepts in JavaScript. For that, as always, I would recommend you to go check out the MDN docs and also check out the other resources that we shared yesterday, as well as we'll be sharing some links today. Tomorrow we will be continuing a bit more on functions as well as objects, and we'll also be starting React with it. So thank you for joining today, everyone, and We'll meet tomorrow. As for your homework or your assignment today, just go through the documentation for JavaScript and try to make small programs using it. Right, the same programs that we did in C, C++, or Java. Try to add some numbers, try to subtract some numbers, try to make a simple text-based calculator. And you can do all of that with all of that within Chrome itself, or if you want, install Node and run it locally, just like I'm doing it right now. We'll share the installation instructions for Node with you. Thank you for joining. If there are any questions, I'm here and I'll be sitting out the chat for the next 5 minutes as well, but the session is over for today.